All of us are influenced by different people in our formative years. Perhaps it is a teacher who inspired us in some special way. Or maybe it was a coach who saw in us great potential to succeed. Could be a music teacher or a choir director who drew out of us talent. It might even have been a pastor who offered us some sort of insight into our relationship with God. For me, it was two particular ministers who also happened to be my parents. Maybe you could call them a twofer of sorts. In any case, be they my pastors or my parents, they had an immense influence on who I am as a person and how I live my life. Reflecting back on it, one of the aspects of that influence that I find most interesting is how very different they were in the models that they offered. My mother was a big presence. She had a booming voice and an extremely extroverted personality. Her favorite thing to do was to be around people, and if not in their physical presence, she would likely be on the phone with someone. In the days before cordless phones, let alone cell phones, I remember well the phone cord stretched across the kitchen at all times. People were truly drawn to my mother. My father, on the other hand, was much quieter, more subtle in his presence, and very much an introvert. He liked people, but his favorite pastime was sitting in his chair with a crossword puzzle and probably a cat curled up at his feet or in his lap. My father made an excellent nap space for cats, as he moved very little when he was working on a crossword puzzle and often fell into a nap in the process. It was sometimes difficult to tell whether or not he was deep in thought about a particular clue or if he was actually asleep. One of the other differences between my parents was in how they responded to difficulty or tragedy. They did so in perhaps polar opposite ways. My mother was the best person I have ever known when it came to rallying the troops. When something bad happened to someone close to her or to her personally, she would go straight to the phone, stretch it across the kitchen, and she would call the entire village together. So when her father passed, she reached out to friends near and far, mostly people from churches, and had the support she needed. Similarly, when she received her cancer diagnosis, each time, the assistance was quickly lined up at her initiation. As a sidebar, this meant that should something bad happen involving me or my brother, even something we did wrong, lots of people knew about it pretty much right away. Being a preacher's kid, you tend to live in a bubble anyway, but this tendency on my mother's part pretty much meant that there was not even a thin layer of soap protecting us. My father, by contrast, did not operate in that fashion. He embodied the role of pastor and caregiver at all times, and he tended to lean on himself in these situations, retreating inward, working through it, and then reemerging on the other side, ready to offer care for others. So when my mother died, my dad spent a lot of time alone, surfacing primarily to offer support to me or to my brother or to their friends and their congregation. And when he faced his own cancer diagnosis, there were no calls made to gather the village, just a lot of reflective walks and more cat-accompanied naps. My friends, each of us deals with tragedy and difficulty in our own way. Perhaps when facing the news of a troubling diagnosis, you simply turn inward like my father and keep others at arm's length. Maybe you don't even share the news with others, choosing to walk that difficult path alone. Maybe when losing your job, you allow your worry or even shame to take control. And rather than reach out for support, you put on a brave face and maintain a facade of cool confidence, even while you're crying out in fear and uncertainty on the inside. It may be that when experiencing the impact of losing a loved one, you feel compelled to bottle up the grief, not wanting to burden others with your pain, I mean, we all have tough times, so why should I dump my troubles on someone else? My friends, in our time, we are not unfamiliar with pain and loss. Hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, mass shootings. There's a lot happening in our world. A lot that can cause us to feel vulnerable, fearful, broken, even hopeless. And that's only what is happening in the headlines. What about loss? What about illness? Our own or our children? What about the loss of a job or a home? There can be so much happening in our lives that can cause us to feel vulnerable and fearful, broken, even hopeless. How do we respond in such moments? By drawing inward or by reaching out? The Israelites in the story of the golden calf seem to me to be incredibly human. So often when we tell this story, we speak of the impatience of the people. They had, after all, been led out of slavery in Egypt by Moses, with the power and glory of God on full display. They had been freed from bondage and were promised a new beginning in a land of their own. And then Moses disappeared up a mountain for 40 days. Now, I'm not one to make excuses for idolatry. Clearly, that is a bad practice. And the people of Israel in this story have made a mistake. But at least a small part of me has to think it is an understandable mistake. I mean, can you blame them? It's not as if Moses said, "Hey, I'll be back in an hour, so talk amongst yourselves." He gave them no time frame for his return. They were not privy, not even Aaron, to what was taking place on the mountain. It had been 40 days, not a short period of time, long enough apparently to flood out the entire world, if we believe the stories of our ancestors. And the people were in the wilderness, away from the only home any of them had ever known. They were short on food, short on water, and short on answers. For all they knew, Moses had abandoned them, and perhaps even God. My friends, while I do not excuse their actions, I understand why they might act. For I am sure they felt vulnerable and fearful, perhaps broken, even hopeless. They were seeking some kind of reassurance, some semblance of comfort, and they did what they would have done in the past. They reached out to other sources, other gods, other idols. Perhaps in our own times of difficulty, we are not led to melt down all of our gold and craft a golden calf of our own, or whatever animal we might choose, given our proximity to the ocean, perhaps a golden dolphin. In any case, not many of us have the equipment or the skill set for smelting and metal crafting. Maybe Dale. But friends, we most certainly have our go-to idols. If it is not our friends or family, perhaps it is a commercial idol in the form of consumer therapy. I myself have a couple of watches and pairs of sunglasses that may have been an attempt to self-comfort. It might also be food or drink, even alcohol or other more destructive substances that are attempts at self-medication. Even a belief in self-sufficiency in times of personal tragedy can be like an idol, as we hold up our own strength and resilience for all to see. Last week we spoke about a church, our church, as a place to be found. And one thing is for certain, to be found, one must first come out from our hiding places. To receive care and comfort in times of trouble and challenge, one must actually make oneself present. And that can prove difficult. As I've said before, we live in a culture that virtually idolizes the concept of self-sufficiency. We don't want others to think that we cannot handle what is before us. We even throw around comments like, God never gives us more than we can handle. Now, I understand the intent in a statement like that. I understand that it is an attempt to reassure someone that they have the strength to come through their difficulties. But what if they don't? What if the pain or grief or sadness or challenge is too much for them alone? I tend to believe that this sentiment could be better phrased. When we are faced with too much to handle on our own, God offers us the resources, the friends, the family, the church, to help us get through. When we champion self-sufficiency and personal strength in times of trouble, I worry that we may cause people at times to turn away from community, to seek other means for support, perhaps even to set aside their relationship with God's people, believing that if they are overwhelmed or hurting, if they are somehow broken, that they must regain a sense of wholeness before they may return to the community. Far too often I hear someone tell me on the way out of church on a Sunday, I was in the hospital and I had surgery a couple weeks ago, but I'm doing much better now. Or a young parent will share, I lost my parent a few weeks back, and we've been working through the grief on our own, but we're back now. My friends, this should cause us to pause. For at the core of our identity as a Christian congregation, as a community of faith, is the call to care for one another. It is the foundation of the sense of community upon which we are built. In this way, we build our life together from within. And without that strong foundation of mutual love and care, we are no more than a service organization or a social club. I spoke earlier about my father. In a significant way, he subscribed to this idea that he, especially in his role as pastor, must somehow be whole and always strong in his interactions with his congregation. And while he was a gifted pastoral care provider, he was a terrible care receiver. And this, in his times of greatest need, served to hinder relationship. Following my mother's passing, his stoic self-sufficiency created distance between he and his congregation. Similarly, following his cancer diagnosis, a similar distance was created with a whole new faith community. It wasn't until he acknowledged his need and accepted the loving support and care of his congregation that the distance disappeared. And what resulted? A wonderful closeness with the entire congregation. For he had allowed himself to be vulnerable. And they had seen the fullness of his humanity. But what was it that caused him to hold back in the first place? Was it something about him that believed he needed to simply be strong? Or was it something about the church and culture that suggested that only whole, healthy people need enter the room? I suspect it was a little of both. Like the Israelites pausing in the wilderness, we all seek comfort and reassurance when we are feeling vulnerable. Who or what are the idols we will turn to in our times of need? Perhaps we might remind ourselves of the welcome we claim as a congregation, one that invites all God's people, no matter their circumstance, no matter their state of brokenness, into the full life of this church. May we remember this in our own times of need. And may we together rededicate ourselves to being a place where the broken may seek wholeness, where the lost may be found. May we build from within our caring community. Amen.